Good morning. This is Trinity Episcopal Church Bible Study. I'm Bill Stahl. Today we're covering chapters 6 through 11 of the book of Genesis. It is the story of Noah and the great flood. This may seem like a children's story or even like a fairy tale, but it's actually a very important story for us as well as it was for the ancient human being. And through the story, we will get insight into the wonder of inspiration. First, we will simply review what the Bible says. Then we will refer to what the scholars tell us regarding who likely wrote it and when, and how it came to be assembled in its present form. Next, we will look at some parallel stories from other ancient cultures. Finally, we'll come back to the Bible and see revealed before us the essential teachings of this story. So, let's begin. Yahweh saw how wicked man on the earth had become, and that the thoughts of his heart were only evil all the time. Yahweh grieved he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. I will rid mankind from the face of the earth, said Yahweh, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah found favor with Yahweh. Taken literally, this passage implies that God is prone to making mistakes. If he was unhappy with his creation then, how much more so must he be today? Correctly understood, this passage reveals the ancient authors' recognition of the shortcomings of mankind, and they often expressed it by putting human emotions into the mouth of God. It was more dramatic to focus on God and his wrath than it was to focus on man and his sin. So God tells Noah the end has come, that he will efface all life from the earth. But since Noah has found favor with him, he will preserve his life and that of his wife and 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. And that life on earth as he intended it might continue, he tells Noah to save a remnant of all living creatures. He tells him he is going to cause a great flood to occur, covering the entire earth, wiping out all life. To save themselves and the animals, he instructs Noah to build an ark and gives him specific instructions for it. The word ark comes from the Latin word arca, which literally means box, and that in essence is what the ark was, a great big box. The Bible's dimensions of the ark are in cubits, but converting them into feet, the ark was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Noah was instructed to build 3 decks within the ark, and so it appears that each deck was 15 feet higher than the lower one. Nautical engineers have studied these dimensions, and they have concluded that a vessel of these proportions would be very stable in rough seas. God tells Noah that of all the living creatures on earth, he is to gather 2 of each kind, male and female of each, and gather them into the ark along with stores of food for himself, his family, and all the animals. But in the next paragraph, which is the beginning of chapter 7, the Bible reads that God tells Noah to gather 7 of each clean animal and 2 of each unclean animal. Clean meant an animal that was acceptable for sacrifice to Yahweh, which probably meant nothing to the people of Noah's day. The scholars explain that 2 groups of authors, the priestly and the Yahwistic, wrote their own versions of the story, and they were later combined by ancient editors. It was the priestly source who wrote 2 of each kind of animal, and the Yahwistic that distinguished between clean and unclean animals. When all is ready, God causes the sluices of heaven to open, and it rains on earth for 40 days and 40 nights. This expression, 40 days, occurs several times throughout the Bible, even in the New Testament, and it actually means simply an extended period of time. The waters swell, lifting the ark high above the earth, and it sails on the waters. The waters swell so much that even the highest mountains are covered, and the flood causes all life on earth to perish. After 150 days, the waters begin to ebb. Mountain peaks begin to appear, and the ark comes to rest atop the mountains of Ararat. Some days later, Noah releases a dove in search of dry land, but the dove, finding nowhere to perch, returns to the ark. After 7 more days, he releases the dove again, and it returns this time with an olive branch in its mouth. Another 7 days later, Noah releases the dove once more, and this time the dove does not return. So Noah opens the hatch, and he beholds dry land. One can only imagine the excitement and joy of Noah and his family as they left the confines of the ark after so many weeks. What had saved their lives to leave, no doubt, now gave them a profound sense of freedom. In thanksgiving to Yahweh, Noah builds an altar and offers a sacrifice of some of the animals he had on board. God, seeing Noah offer this sacrifice when he has so little, says he will never again curse the earth. As long as the earth endures, he says, sowing and weeping, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall cease no more. God then blesses Noah and his sons as they venture forth from the ark into an uninhabited world. Be fruitful and fill the earth, he tells them, which makes Noah, in essence, the new Adam. Then God gives Noah this strange command. I give you everything, he says, with this exception. You must not eat flesh with life, that is to say, blood in it. I will demand an account of your lifeblood. What does this mean? Well, the ancient Israelite believed that the life of a living being, man or animal, was contained in its blood, that the blood held the essence of the life of the being. When they sacrificed an animal to Yahweh, they displayed profound respect for its life by draining the blood and splashing it upon the sides of the altar before burning the carcass upon it. Some scholars believe this command was a warning by God against cannibalism. They believe cannibalism began through warfare, where the victor completed his defeat over his enemy by literally devouring him. They also think cannibalism was associated with the practice of human sacrifice, whether the victim was a fellow tribesman or an enemy, and that it may have been the quest for a victim that spawned warfare. Even so, Noah and his family had no one to cannibalize. So it seems that the command either refers to future generations regarding cannibalism, or it refers to compassion and respect given to sacrificial animals. Then God establishes a covenant with Noah, promising he will never again destroy life on earth. He sets his bow in the sky, the rainbow, as an everlasting sign of this covenant between himself and man. The story of Noah ends with a strange account. While it may seem insignificant to modern readers, it was surely important to the author's readers. The text reads that Noah was a tiller of the soil and was the first to plant the vine, meaning the grapevine, and from the grapes he makes wine and becomes drunk, so much so that he passes out in his tent and lies there naked. His middle son, Ham, sees his father in this state, and he tells his brothers. And we get the impression he does so in a laughing manner. The two brothers, Shem and Japheth, in an act of respect for their father, drape a cloak between them across their shoulders and walk backwards into their father's tent, lest they see him in this state, and gently place the cloak over their father. When Noah awakes and learns what has happened, he utters this startling curse and then this blessing. Accursed be Canaan. He shall be his brother's lowest slave. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave. According to the author's genealogical beliefs, Ham was the ancestor of the Canaanites, Israel's bitter enemy. Shem was the ancestor of the Israelites, and Japheth was the ancestor of tribes friendly with Israel. So the passage is a prophetic curse and blessing by Noah on the descendants of his sons. This knowledge of ancestry was very important to the priestly source who wrote this account and to the readers of their day. It was important to the priests to reveal to the people of Israel where they came from, their ancestry, their heritage, and where other people came from, and why some people were good and others were bad. Particularly, it was important to them to show God's continuous favor toward his chosen people, and thus Noah's blessing upon Shem. And indeed, what follows in the Bible is a long genealogy stretching from Noah through Shem down to Abraham. But the genealogy is interrupted by a short story of the Tower of Babel. This story was written by the Yahwistic authors to give their readers an understanding of the migration of peoples and the development of the various languages. Here is the biblical account from chapter 11. The whole world had one language and a common speech. The people moved eastward. They found a valley in the land of Shinar, later Babylonia, and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them in fire." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth." But Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. He said, "So, as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this. Now nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another." Yahweh scattered them from there over all the earth, so that they stopped building the city. That is why the city is called Babel, because there Yahweh confused their language, and from there he scattered them over the face of the earth. In addition to the priestly source, the scholars believe the story of Noah was also written by the Yahwistic tradition, and that later editors combined pieces of both versions to form the text as we have it today. Indeed, the text has a certain disjointedness. A phrase is often repeated in the next paragraph, and the story has its inconsistency. As I pointed out, the scholars believe the priestly source wrote two kinds of each animal, or two of each animal should board the ark, and it was the Yahwistic that said 7 of the clean and 2 of the unclean. I also spoke of the dove that Noah had released. Well, it also says at another part that he released a raven. Some scholars believe that the priestly source had a reason to embellish the story. Genealogy was very important to them, and they may have run into a problem tracing it all the way back to Adam. So they simply expanded Noah's flood, wiping out the entire human race, and thereby solved the problem. Now they could write their genealogy from Abraham directly back to one of Noah's sons, as in fact that genealogy appears at the end of the story. Now, that might seem to be a gross manipulation and distortion of the facts, a falsification of the record. But we must be careful in passing judgment on an ancient people with our 21st century standards and values. Historical, factual accuracy was not as important to the authors as was the heritage of the people of Israel. Whether or not they had all the names and all the generations exactly correct did not change what they sincerely believed to be true, that the people of Israel were descendants of the great patriarchs of old, and thus they were God's chosen. More than that, this story is not unique to the Hebrew Scriptures. Ancient Babylonian stories of a great flood are older than this story. Scholars believe that the Babylonian story may have been the source of the biblical story, or that both stories drew upon the same source, the memory of a devastating floods in the valleys of the Euphrates and Tigris River. In fact, similar stories of a terrible flood wiping out all but a handful of survivors have been found in many ancient cultures. Several years ago, I met an Anglican priest from Africa who was also the chief of his tribe. He told me an ancient story from his tribal culture about a great flood that killed many people. In his story, it was a river in Africa that flooded. So, what are we to believe about this story? Is it a fable? A children's fairy tale? I think it likely that there really was a Noah, and there really was a devastating flood. The mountains of Ararat, from which the Euphrates and Tigris drain, are known to have been volcanic, and therefore would have risen in elevation several thousands of years ago. This would have caused larger snow caps to form on them, and thus greater flooding of the two rivers with the spring thaws. There were likely years when heavy rains accompanied the melting snow, causing both rivers to flood at the same time, and massive destruction. The entire planet did not flood. There is no reliable, objective evidence to support that belief. But what did primitive man know of the planet? He thought the world was flat, and he had no concept of its size. The poor man in the floodwaters, hanging on to a piece of driftwood for dear life and unable to see land in any direction, to him it would have certainly seemed that the whole world had flooded. After such a flood, the few survivors, finding entire villages wiped out, would have sought an explanation. And their logical conclusion would have been that the gods had become unhappy with mankind. Noah was probably an astute man living in the Euphrates-Tigris Valley area who recognized the spring thaws were worsening, or spring floods were worsening each year. And so he built his house of wood, capable of floating, and large enough to hold his farm animals and extra stores in addition to his family. After a particularly devastating flood, he survived to find not only his own village, but several others up and down the valley completely wiped out. That's just my theory. So we have a wonderful teaching here that was of fundamental importance to ancient man, and it still remains important for us today. It is God's promise to Noah that he will never again destroy life on earth. The essential teaching is this: God will never do anything to harm the earth nor any life on it. So let's see why this was important to people of long ago. Early primitive human beings experienced things in the world that they could not explain or understand, yet recognized to be far more powerful than themselves. Among these things were forces of nature, such as floods, earthquakes, erupting volcanoes, strong winds, and lightning bolts. He reasoned that there must be something out there or up there responsible for these frightening phenomena, and so, through the power of reason, they invented the concept of gods. They saw these gods as anything but friendly. They were menacing troublemakers who caused only fear and hardship for poor man. So the primitive religions consisted of sacrifices and superstitious rituals aimed at appeasing the gods to get them off their backs and leave them alone. Then came a people, the ancestors of the Hebrews, who pledged loyalty to a god they called Yahweh. They were not monotheistic. They acknowledged the gods of other tribes and clans, but Yahweh was their God. And according to their ancient stories, this Yahweh did something never before heard of. He promised never to harm the earth, nor any life on it. This was unprecedented. Never before had any tribe or clan professed that the God of their religion had anything akin to a good side. This new belief, this understanding, because it associated God with goodness, became one of the primary stimulations of the evolution of the Hebrew faith. Theirs was a faith in Yahweh God, who was at first to them just a God among gods. Then he became the greatest of all gods, and later the God of all gods. Finally, the Hebrews' descendants, the Jews, progressed to a faith understanding of the one universal God of all that is, and that he was, above all things, good and loving. So let us now try to look at this from God's perspective. In our last lesson, we saw that God gave his promise for salvation to a world that had just fallen. In this lesson, we see that plan activated. The first thing that God decides to do is to assure man that he has no reason to fear him. He cannot hope to teach fallen man his truth if he is scared to death of him. And so he makes this promise: I will do nothing to harm the earth, nor all life on it. Put your fears of me aside. Only after fear is set aside can God begin to teach his people about himself, about themselves, and about his eternal truth. Only then can mankind be in a state of mind ready to receive these teachings, a state of mind in peace and free from fear. Now we see the wonder of inspiration. Noah was inspired to build his house to survive a devastating flood. And then, by gazing upon a rainbow, he was inspired to a faith understanding of God's promise of kindness to humanity. The wonder of inspiration continues to the tellers, the writers, and even to the embellishers of the story. For through them came the essential teaching of Yahweh's positive disposition toward man. I will not harm the earth, nor any life thereon. So what value has the teaching to us here in the 21st century, long after primitive mankind? It is still relevant today, as all pure truth is. Bad things happen on earth today, just as they did ages ago, and it may seem even more so now. The teaching is that God does not cause those bad things. He never did and never will. The sad, tragic events of life are the result of the fact that we live in a fallen world, separated from God and from the world of heaven He created for us. It is the result of our state of fallenness. God's plan of salvation is to raise us up from our fallen state, whether it be in the timeline of humanity or in the span of one yearning soul's life. That is His promise to us, and that, I think, is the inspiration Noah received in his heart when he beheld the rainbow. Well, God bless you all. Forgive me for not beginning this lesson with a prayer, but I'll sure end it with one. So let us pray. Praise be Jesus Christ, sovereign of the universe and Savior of the world. Amen.